Rail Up, the future mobility podcast with innovators and leaders of the ecosystem. Presented by Sebastian Sperker.
My guest today is Ida Posner, Vice President of Strategic Planning at Rail Development Corporation, in short RDC. Ida brings a global perspective as a rail investor and will share her insights into identifying the perfect investment opportunity in the industry. We also dive into the role of a female leadership within the rail ecosystem and explore her vision for the future of rail mobility in 2050. Join me in welcoming one of the most dynamic and inspiring personalities in rail, live from Pittsburgh. Let's talk. Hi, Ida, and welcome to my podcast. Welcome to Rail Up. And let's start the question with Ida. You see yourself more an innovator or as a leader?
Hi, it's great to be here. That's a great question. I would say I see myself as a leader who supports innovators. One of the really fun parts of my job is getting to take a really broad and wide view at the rail industry globally, and getting to support the people who are really doing the work day to day.
Great. And let's start. In the recent episodes, I've showcased several exciting rail tech companies with ambitious vision to transform their rail ecosystem. And these innovations ranges from autonomous self-propelled rail cars, such as from automotive and Hyperloop technology, to underground cargo tunnels, advanced loading concepts, and of course AI. But however, as Nathan mentioned in our very first episode of Rail Up, venture capitalists and investors are often overlook the rail industry because they perceive it as a slow-moving, resistant to innovation, and outdated. And investments tend to focus on traditional areas such as wagon fleets, locomotive pools, or suppliers. But yet there are actually companies driving change by investing in cutting-edge technology, rail infrastructure, and software solutions. So let's shift the perspective and dive into the insight of a successful rail investor. Please join me in welcoming Ida Posner. And Ida, my first question would be, your LinkedIn profile mentioned that you're investing in both food and rail. And that's actually an unusual combination for a portfolio. How did that come to be?
Thanks again, Sebastian. It's great to be here. So, RDC is a family-owned railway investment and management company, and we take a really broad approach to investing in the railroad ecosystem. So, we've historically been an investor in freight railroads, but more recently have moved into some passenger operations, infrastructure, and rail technology. One of the things I find most fascinating about the rail industry is that it is really the backbone of our economy, especially here in North America. We have an extremely robust freight railroad system. And so if you take that as a starting point, you then can learn quite a lot about how our food, our energy, how everything we use and consume in this country is transported. And it's a fascinatingly complex industry that has really stood the test of time. Where the origins of our portfolio in food started, was actually taking a different perspective, which is thinking about from an impact perspective, if we want to design a system and an economy that is more efficient and sustainable and is better using our resources, and we think about our food system, about a third of the food that we produce globally goes to landfill. It's never consumed. And I find it to be one of the most frustrating and honestly one of the world's dumbest problems because it's solvable and can have really significant impacts for people, planet, and the economy. And there is some convergence between obviously how we move and transport food and transportation systems. So there is some convergence between those two, but it is also a really interesting role to be able to sit in both worlds on food and rail and freight transportation at the same time.
You're working for RDC and it's actually the business of your family. So what is your role and how comes that the Posner family running a rail investor company?
So RDC was founded by my father, Henry Posner, who's chairman of the company, and his lifelong passion has always been railroads. And he has been in the industry his whole career. And so it's played a significant role both in his life and our whole family's life. You know, I grew up with a lot of exposure to railroads and specifically on the freight side. So in the US as compared to Europe, there aren't necessarily as many chances to take a passenger train. Our network is not as robust as in Europe. But at the same time, our freight rail network is the envy of the world. And so having that perspective from an early age, that when we talk about railroads, we're not just talking about passenger trains, was a really interesting perspective to grow up with. And then it was actually a trip to our railroad in Peru, probably about 10 years ago with my father, which really sparked an interest in joining RDC professionally and seeing that railroad, which is the second highest in the world by elevation and has to deal with really significant environmental challenges every year, from flooding, from the effects of El Nino. And so to see the engineering and operational challenges that railway faces, and then to see how quickly they're able to recover and put it back together and get back up and running when something does happen, was really inspiring and exciting, and was, again, one of the things that sparked my interest in joining RDC.
And then basically you just said, okay, let's follow like the spirit of my father and entering into the family business and into the ecosystem of rail.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've learned is that railroads become far more interesting and complex the more you learn about them, and how much you can learn only grows. And so I love being in a role where I get to learn every day and to think about how we can design a better system and a better industry. And so that level of excitement has only grown as I've gotten deeper into the industry. And it's also an industry full of people who are really passionate about what they do, deeply knowledgeable, and really committed. So all of those factors have really amplified my desire to stay in the industry, even though that kind of that intro point was obviously heavily influenced by my father's passion for it.
And actually, what was your personal magic moment which opens the door to get into the ecosystem of rail?
I'll try and tell this story in a succinct way. Our railroad in Peru is the freight railroad, runs from the port of Callao in Lima to Huancayo in the Andes. And the highest point is Galera, which is 15,000 feet above sea level. It's really spectacular. So we were there doing a trip on the entire railroad, and we got up to near the summit, and a massive storm came in and washed out three really significant parts of the track below us. And this is an area where there is one highway and one railroad that allow you to transit this area. That's it. So we spent the next 3 days up at altitude with our team as they quite literally put the railroad back together. And you had pieces of track hanging in the air, pieces of the mountain completely gone. The highway was closed as well. Traffic was completely stopped. And in under 3 days, they got it up and running again, and actually started to run passenger trains to make sure that people could transit the area as well. And I was just really struck by, in in such an extreme environment, how people were so prepared and proactive and thinking in a problem-solving mindset to get this done, to do it safely, and to think about how do we open up this mode of transportation, which is so critical both for all the industry that's active in that area, but also for the people who need to move through that corridor.
That's a great story. And we were also faced in Austria by a destroyed infrastructure on one of our major or most important corridors due to a heavy flood. And then you realize which great impact long track closure could have. I mean, people cannot anymore travel to work. Cargo could not be delivered in time to all industries, gas stations, supermarkets. But usually the importance is often not seen by most of the people, as this business is operating mostly in the background.
Yeah, in many ways, railroads operate as a stealth industry. It's in the background. It might not be front of mind until something does happen. And then it is a really big deal, right? Because they are such a critical part of our economy. And so when there is a slowdown, we saw that during COVID. That's when people start to pay attention. But on a good day, we are doing our job. You might not even be aware, if you're living in an urban environment, of really the complexity and the importance of railroads.
Yep. I remember, like during COVID, suddenly, like the local drivers really get to heroes actually to transport toilet paper and pasta and through the borders. Yeah, it was really.
Absolutely.
Can you just tell me a little bit more about like RTC and about your role? Because our topic is also how to invest in rail. What is your portfolio? What is your role in RDC?
So I'm a VP at RDC, and I focus on strategic planning. And so a lot of what my role is thinking about where are we going to look for new areas of investment, and how can I connect the dots with our current portfolio to best support them in their in their day-to-day work. So our portfolio is diverse. In the U.S., we have the Iowa Interstate Railroad, which is a Class 2 regional running from Council Bluffs in Iowa, which is just on the border across from Omaha, into Chicago. And so that is a freight railroad. Our customers are mainly agricultural producers, and we sit right in the center of the country and connect with all 6 Class 1 railroads. So it really is a premier Class 2 railroad. We are incredibly proud of the story of the Iowa Interstate. Its origins were actually out of bankruptcy of the former Rock Island. So we've gone from being a bankrupt railroad to really a premier regional railroad today. I mentioned that we also are shareholders in FCCA in Peru, which is the freight railroad running from Lima into the Andes, and serving a lot of industrial clients there. In Europe, which is a relatively new region for us, if you look historically at RDC's history, we've worked all over the world in Latin America, a little bit in sub-Saharan Africa, and the European portfolio is more recent. So in France and Belgium, we have Eurorail and RegioRail, which combines both short line freight logistics and some warehousing operations. And so you can make some parallels with Eurorail and RegioRail with some of the U.S. short line operations, but we also do long haul moves as well. And then in Germany, we have RDC Deutschland, which is a really interesting business that has many different aspects to it. So as we were chatting about earlier, we run the auto trains of the island of Zilt in the north. We have a number of regional operations headquartered in Hamburg, really in Schleswig-Holstein. We have night train operations. We provide rolling stock for other night train operators. We recently have gotten into some infrastructure investments, and so now actually own some infrastructure in Germany, which is a little bit of a unique aspect for a private company. And then we have begun to do some rail technology investments. We are an investor into RailFlow in Germany as well, and then RailPulse in the US, which is the North American freight rail initiative to put telematics devices on rail cars. And that allows us to track location, condition, and health of rail cars, which supports increased safety as well as a better commercial interface for our customers and working closely with our shippers. So as a company, RDC is quite diversified, both in geography and sector in the rail space. But all of this is really driving towards, we fundamentally believe that rail is a core part of growing our global economy. And we take a very broad perspective on that.
Well, one thing what was quite interesting to read about was the pop-up metro. I think it's in the testing phase. As a read, can you just tell us a little bit more, because I find the concept quite interesting?
Yes. And we started this conversation talking about innovation. So pop-up metro is really, really a core part of that. So in the US and also in many parts in Europe, you have a rail network where there are smaller branch lines or pieces of the physical infrastructure that might be underutilized, but also sit geographically in an area where there is a huge demand for commuter services or for any kind of public transit. Often to get those projects off the ground takes a lot of time and money and political will, and people honestly get exhausted before it even starts. And so the idea with pop-up metro is to identify certain corridors where there is existing infrastructure, so you're not laying new track, and there is a demand for passenger rail. And instead of doing a long drawn-out study, to use a set of battery electric BMU trains to actually start a service and prove the demand. And if it works, that's great. You can go back and build out a full system. And if not, you've had a great test, you provided a service for a little bit. It's also easy to take away and move on. So the pop-up metro design is to bring trains, temporary platforms, and an operating model to these areas where we really believe there's an opportunity for passenger rail, but logistically, they haven't been able to make it work. So we are particularly excited about it because it is a zero tailpipe emission solution that can really get these transit projects started in a much faster and simpler way.
You also have like the platforms and maybe the train station, but you can pack everything in container and just say, let's move on. We make somewhere else like the pop-up metro. Is it really that flexible, or you need to? Is it like a circus? Just-
So in theory, it is that simple. Obviously, there's going to be specifics for every operation. But I mean, as a simple example, we actually took our platforms and ran a pop-up operation, not using our rolling stock, using existing trains in the Boston area for a sports event. And so you really can bring these platforms and get something up and running quite quickly. And then with the trains themselves, if you're using North American infrastructure, you're going to have the same gauge. You're going to have a lot of the same operating rules. Um, so the more complex part is actually getting from a regulatory approval all of the complexities in place with getting your operating model approved. But the physical assets, yeah, you really can pick them up and move them around.
You already described that RDC is portfolios globally and diverse, and that your companies are also investing in incumbents where politics plays an important role. What is your experience in this investment field?
It's quite challenging. I mean, you see that a lot in Europe right now, right? And there are, we're operating under open access, but obviously you are competing against big state-owned incumbents. And so we fundamentally believe competition makes everyone better. And it's a challenging environment to operate in. And one of the really challenging things about France and Germany as compared to the US is that you don't own your infrastructure, so you can't really control your own destiny there. In the US, the majority of rail infrastructure is privately owned. Now, that means as an industry, we're putting a quarter of our revenue back into the physical infrastructure. It's a high cost operation. But if you do the proper investment, you really can control your operations in a different way. That can be really challenging in Europe. We were just talking about Peru, how our team is able to put a railroad back together in 3 days. You can deal with flooding enclosures in Europe that cost 3 months or 3 years. And your hands are tied. There's not really a whole lot you can do. So it's a challenging environment when the rules can change without your control. That being said, railroads are they are obviously they're where they are, right? So you have to do your diligence on what is the regulatory environment, what is the political situation, how much does that affect the railroads? Because in some cases, railroads can just keep doing their thing. And others, you're going to be really reliant on what's the funding outlook or the regulatory outlook in that geography. So each geography, each railroad is unique, even though there are many similarities across the industry.
This is still like investing really in these old traditional railroads as part of the package, and also for strategic investments.
Yeah, it's interesting to use the language on kind of old school railroads. Railroads are a really incredibly efficient and safe way of moving things, and that fact holds so strong. And so, while looking at the freight rail industry, you may think, oh, trains are the way they have been since they were created. Locomotives are highly complex computers, and there are really advanced technologies already in place on the railroad. While visually it may look similar, um, they're not the way they used to be. And so we are long-term investors, right? We're a family business. And so our investment horizon is going to be much more patient and long-term than even, a public company, which might be looking at a quarterly return level. And that's really the mindset you have to take in railroading, because you are making investments that are going through economic cycles, and are the lifetime of these assets is just so much longer than a software company or a profile that other investors might look at.
Okay, so let's put my statement into context. In comparison to the Hyperloop, today's railroad are following a long-term proven approach. So that I meant by all the industry. And actually this industry can be also quite interested and sexy for an investor, as you mentioned. And especially if you take into account that this is the most efficient way to transport cargo and passenger on land. But back here in Europe, our rail freight operations are very often not really profitable, and that's the difference in the US. So, as some of the RAILUPPODCAST already stated, so it's even high profitable, and I think at the end, probably a good investment.
Yeah, and I think that from an impact perspective, and my background is actually in environmental engineering. I spent many years working on environmental issues, and we were talking earlier about my interests in food waste, which is a huge lever um, to reduce methane emissions. Rails Railroads are the safest and most efficient form of surface transportation, and so we can use technology that's available today to get a 75% reduction in emissions by moving freight from truck to rail. And so that alone, that's held true for a long time. As an industry, we have a lot of work to do, and we're doing it on how do we further decarbonize rail as a mode of transportation. But if we're looking at how do we design a freight transportation system that is going to have the lowest carbon impact today, it's moving more by rail. And if you think about the externalities in terms of safety and public benefits of taking that freight off
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
highway, it's massive, right? From a both public safety perspective, but also, an infrastructure perspective of you're putting heavy trucks on the road, and that's tax dollars going to pay for those roads versus the private investment from the rail side. So I really fundamentally believe that is a critical part of this, which is why, as an industry, we are taking steps to make it easier for our shippers to ship by rail, because we can't just expect people to show up and give us more business. We have to do a better job at taking the friction out of the process of how do you ship by rail and how do we grow the industry in terms of a modal perspective.
You invested also like in software or tech companies with the focus on rail, so in rail pulse and rail flow. So, but this is a new area of your business. And what do you think about it?
I'm excited about a lot of the developments happening in rail technology. And I can talk a little bit about rail flow and rail pulse, but I think overall, the technologies we're excited about are technologies that help people do their job in a safer and better, more efficient way. And then technologies that make it easier for customers to ship by rail. So we have to, safety is always the number one priority. So I am particularly excited about any technologies that are going to improve safety. I think that by improving safety, you are improving the quality of the jobs we are offering as an industry, and that's really core to us having a strong workforce and a happy, satisfied workforce. And then again, if we want to grow as an industry, we have to think about how do we make it easier for our customers and provide them with a better service product. So Railflow is working on basically building out that commercial platform, and how do you design an ecosystem that is going to connect rail providers with shippers and create that kind of online marketplace, but also internally for railroads be able to manage their commercial operations in a better way. Rail Pulse, which is in North America, again, is focused on getting telematics onto rail cars and tracking location, condition, and health. And the goal of Rail Pulse itself is more the platform approach. So it's agnostic as to your telematics vendor, and is really trying to be the single source of truth for this data, with the goal of having all the stakeholders involved speaking the same language and sharing their data in a way that is supportive of the industry, but also protects everyone's data privacy. So the ownership model of Rail Pulse and the governance model includes Class 1 railroads, short line railroads, car lessors, and importantly, shippers. So bringing in that shipper perspective to Rail Pulse has been really critical, again, to bring everyone to the table and say, hey, how do we design a system that really promotes growth and a better service product here and safety while doing this all together, right? And so I'm really excited about how Rail Pulse is going to be able to transform the industry, both from a safety and a commercial standpoint.
I think you hit a really good point. And I see firsthand that most of the rail freight companies are not good at selling their product in an easy and convenient way to the customer. I just recently attended to a big conventions with big shippers, and a lady asked me what I have to do if I would like to book a train to transport cargo. And as I started to explain the process, she just said, "That's crazy. On the road, I can use plenty of platforms. I get offers within seconds, and I even can book it immediately. While on a rail, it takes like quite an effort." So yes, I also believe that we need to create platforms that enables easy and convenient and sexy access to rail. And we need to have this part of the business much more in the focus. But for good performance and connectivity of a platform, it's starting always with data sharing. And Europe is quite known for the very strict data protection guideline. And as RDC is operating in Europe and US, actually, are there big differences? I mean, I can imagine the US using the sharing of data in a much more easier way. I mean, I'm not a data expert, data protection expert, but at least from an outside perspective, you might get this impression.
Yeah, I'm also not an expert on this and certainly not a legal expert on it. I do think that from a regulatory perspective, maybe stepping away from the data sharing within companies, there are some real challenges in Europe right now. If you're trying to get equipment approved, the regulatory hoops you have to jump through can really be extensive and exhausting.
It's a
And
nice wording.
yeah, it's it's a little bit much. Um, and I think there are ways to ask questions that are um, there are steps you can go through to ensure safety and to ensure that you're creating a pro-competitive environment. And there's ways to go overkill on it, right? And it's very situation specific. I know that with Rail Pulse, we're trying to be incredibly thoughtful with answering that exact question, which is making sure everyone feels really confident in this platform. Because if everyone's not confident in it, it's not going to work. And so data privacy and visibility is a core part of that. And, it's something we take extremely seriously, and designing a system that achieves both, right? Everyone feels confident and secure in the platform. And at the same time, it's sharing enough data that it's actually creating those efficiencies. That's the fine line you have to walk. But I agree. It's a balance, and there are some situations where it can really skew to one side. And to your point, it really not only hampers innovation, but sometimes it even stops you from doing what you're already doing. I mean, and so it can be incredibly frustrating.
I think there are a lot of companies out there in Europe with the same experience and feelings. But so let's get back to RDC and investments. Usually you have in every portfolio stars, cash cows, and poor dogs. Can you just tell us about great success on the one hand, and also maybe some epic fails on the other hand to get the both sides of the coin?
Yeah, and of course we never pick favorites. But we do love to talk about our failures because that's how you learn, right? And certainly in the world of investing, you're gonna have more failures than you're gonna have success stories, unless you're really great at your job, in which case, would love to meet those people. Um, I will say I talked a little bit about the history of the Iowa Interstate, and that is just such a remarkable story. And I've been lucky to join. I've been with RDC for close to 8 years now. So I've only been there for the most recent chapter in the Iowa Interstate's history, but to go from a bankrupt railroad into a property that, from an infrastructure and commercial perspective, continues to grow, continues to operate safely, continues to be a place that people love working at. That has just been such an incredible success story. And we are really proud to be such a big part of Iowa and Illinois and the local economies and the communities that we're operating through. And so we really, really love to reflect on that. We just celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Iowa Interstate, and it was a great moment to think about all the people who really helped us get to where we are today. So that's been an incredible success. Um, on some of our, I would say, learnings, we were talking earlier about uh, the environment and climate and all of that. And we were investors in a company called Viva Rail in the UK, which was manufacturing battery trains and actually taking former London Underground rolling stock and upcycling them into brand new trains with completely new modular propulsion. And we were a bit early to market, and also it was really hard to compete as a small company doing manufacturing and R&D. And for a number of reasons, the sales cycle for getting commitments to purchase trains was much longer than expected. COVID certainly didn't help with what that did for the passenger rail market in the UK. Um, And so that was one of our more recent challenges and then big learnings. And it's helped me to take a more critical eye towards the decarbonization efforts in the rail industry, which I want to be clear, I think are really important and exciting and something we need to move towards. And it also needs to be supported um, by the right technologies and the right economics. I think if you look at the US right now, you know, there are some really efficient diesel locomotives out there which are doing a fantastic job. And again, if we can get that modal shift from highway to rail, we're getting the emissions reductions today. Doesn't mean we don't need to keep investing in new technologies, whether it be battery, hydrogen, all the above. Um, but switching overnight to a new system isn't really feasible for a rail system which has so much invested into the physical infrastructure. So I take a more balanced approach and a more yes and approach to we need multiple um, sources of propulsion, and we also need to advance those in a thoughtful way that makes economic sense.
That's actually an interesting takeaway, what you described. So rather follow the path of evolution rather than the revolution or disruption. However, what would you recommend other investors to invest in the ecosystem of rail?
Hmm. It's a great question. And so anything I say, of course, take it with a giant grain of salt. I'll go back to the two kind of categories that I was talking about earlier in terms of how do we support safety and help our labor force do their job in a safer, more efficient way. So there's a lot of interesting technologies now in supporting inspections of cars and of infrastructure. Railroads cover a lot of ground. And so being able to make sure we're taking care of our physical infrastructure takes a lot of time and man hours. And so being able to create some efficiencies there while amplifying safety, I think is really exciting. And then on the commercial side, if you look at RailPulse, once that platform's up and running, I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting learnings that come out of it. And so I will be super curious to follow, as we learn more with AI tools and being able to better understand the data that we're collecting. I think there could be some really interesting observations there. Um, and then I'm still, very excited by investing in the physical assets themselves. I mean, it's not a necessarily a portfolio for a venture investor, right, to be investing in an actual railroad, but we're seeing a lot of investment from and a lot of interest from longer term investors, from infrastructure funds who really do see the underlying value in the freight rail system, and I do think that will hold. There is capacity in the rail system. We can be moving more. And so I think there's a great growth story there. So investing in both the physical assets and the infrastructure, but also the tools that are going to help us create that growth from both a commercial and operational perspective, I think are the areas that I would look.
Yep. Okay, so basically my next question would be how a perfect target for investment looks like in your opinion, but you already answered it.
See, efficiency is right there.
Efficiencies everywhere. So Ida, you are probably one of the best role models for female leadership in the rail ecosystem. What is your personal experience?
In the US, there's an increasing number of female leadership positions, and that has been really exciting to see. Um, there needs to be more. And candidly, I struggle. I go to Intertrons every 2 years, and for those who aren't familiar, it's the world's largest rail trade show. I think last year there were 170,000 people there. It's huge. It's massive, and you meet a ton of people. And I always I make a stack of all the business cards I collect, and it can be a literal count of how many women did I meet and how many men, and it's normally maybe 5% on a good day, and it's really challenging. There's a lot we need to do as an industry, beginning with how do we attract people into the industry at all, but then how do we keep them engaged and promote them and get them into management and senior leadership positions. I was at a really fantastic Women in Rail event last year, and one of the conversations was around mentorship versus sponsorship. And sponsorship being when you are really saying, hey, this is someone I see potential in, and I'm going to vouch for them. I'm going to invite them to a meeting or, put their name in the hat for a promotion or make an introduction for them where I'm vouching for them personally and really bringing them in and bringing them along, in addition to being a mentor who's giving advice and being a thought partner. And so I'd love to see more of that sponsorship. I've been very lucky to have the best sponsor in the world. I work closely with my father, and he does that on a regular basis, and I am incredibly grateful for it. But having that diverse perspective, having women in the room is one aspect of having diverse perspectives. But I think it's really critical. And especially as we are starting to think about, how do we attract people to want to be in this industry? We need to have more female leadership presence. And that work can't just come from the women having to advocate for themselves. And I'm always really energized when I see male leaders really stepping up and making that a priority. And I think there is general acceptance that it's important to have female leadership. The next step is, okay, what are the action items to really make that happen? And so, if you look again at the US class ones, you've got Katie Farmer and Tracy Robinson and Beth Whitehead, who are in those leadership positions, which is incredibly inspiring. And so the question is, how do we grow that? How do we bring more people along and really support them? And even though there may be some kind of uncomfortable growing pains, really being more active and intentional.
Yeah, I think that's really something we have to work on, because you said, yeah, there is on the agenda really to have much more female leaders, but at the moment, at least, the output is it's not really.
We can do better.
Big.
We can do better.
Exactly. Let's talk about the big picture. Which is the biggest problem for the ecosystem of rail today, if you need to pick one?
I'll answer this first from the freight perspective, and then I would actually welcome your perspective as someone who is able to use the passenger rail network, more frequently than someone living in the U.S. I think that when we look at the comment you made earlier about if you want to move something by truck, you can just Google it or use Uber Freight. Right there are apps out there for this. It can be fairly frictionless for the customer. As an industry, we have to do a better job at making it easier for our customers to use rail. Part of that is designing better service products and improving reliability and consistency, being able to say, here's when your stuff is going to get to you. Here's where it is now. Part of it is thinking about how do we educate customers on how to use rail, because it can be a little bit more of a learning curve. But once you do figure it out, can be a much better option than trucking. I think as much as I want to believe that people will move things by rail because it's better for the environment, at the end of the day, it's really hard to convince someone to pay more for something just because it's good for the world. So I think at the core, we have to be providing a better service product. And we have to be communicating that to our customers in a way that works for them. So really being customer first. I think that's one of the strongest parts of the short line industry in the US, is that we're a very customer focused segment of the industry. There's over 600 short lines in the US, and we are the first and last mile service. And we're the ones who really know our customers well and are often able to capture that growth. And then better collaboration with our class one partners is what we can do on our side. And that's kind of what we can control, right? How do we design a better system? Externally, I do think there is an opportunity for letting innovation run a little bit faster, or maybe not even faster, but expanding the realm of what's possible for innovation in this sector. We, work closely with our regulatory bodies here in the US, and would love to see more of that collaboration and kind of expanding the realm of possibilities of what we can test and trial, because there are some solutions out there where they're proving the technology and we're not necessarily able to scale at the pace we'd like to for a range of issues. And so thinking about how we can accelerate adoption of those solutions is also a critical part.
Talking about innovation, what is, in your opinion, the biggest disruptive technology in our sector right now? From Pittsburgh, at least, the full-scale feasibility study from the Hyperloop was done. Is there anything what you really see that could be the super game changer?
Yeah, well, just one comment on Hyperloop, which I think it is, to me, that's a moonshot, right? And it's important to have exciting moonshots. I'd rather get the basics done really well first, and I think there are some things that we can do right now to improve utilization of current assets, and to think about, the near term opportunities. Though certainly as someone who travels far too much for work, I would love it if I could do more of that by rail instead of an airplane. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but I really am excited about Rail Pulse. I think it is a much needed step forward for the industry, and getting all that buy-in is really critical and has been a lot of work and energy from the stakeholders involved, and is hitting a point where we're now in commercial launch, and we're seeing already a lot of learnings come out of it. So I'm super excited to see where Rail Pulse takes us. I think it's going to be transformative for the industry. And then from a safety and technology perspective as well, I think a lot of these um, technologies that can support better inspections and some of the automation advances that we're seeing are really exciting as well.
I think your comment was not like old fashioned, but I think it's the same with AI. To whoever you talk to and who is really an expertise on the topic, it's basically you can do the algorithm on the one hand, but you always need the clean, structured, centralized data. And without data, you don't have the AI application run in a good way. And I think the same is also like with rail. You need first also the basic infrastructure, and then you can really getting better. Do you believe that Hyperloop will construct?
No,
No.
I do not, but I would love to be proven wrong.
What would be your gender if you will be nominated as Secretary of Transportation?
Ooh, great question. I think that some of the things that we already do in this country to support railroads, I would amplify. And again, at the end of the day, the question is, how do we make it easy for people, whether you're a passenger, whether you're a shipper, to use railroads, right? And how do we really level a playing field for modes of transportation? And I'll give my kind of U.S. focused answer, because that's the one I'm closest to. We have a little bit of an unfair competition with trucking right now because highways are publicly funded, railroads are privately funded. And some of the counterbalances to that include some specific tax credits, for example, 45G, which is really critical to the short line industry because that allows us to claim a tax credit for money that we are investing into our infrastructure. And again, when you're a smaller company, making those longer term capital investments can be really challenging. And so that's been a crucial program that I would love to see expanded, and really it's been solidified now, but making sure that that keeps up with the pace of inflation, for example. And there's some great grant programs out there, such as CRISI, that are really critical, again, to railroads being able to make the capital investments they need to keep our physical infrastructure safe and to also promote growth of the sector. So I think amplifying some of those programs, and then taking a really balanced approach to regulation. I think that there are real opportunities to work with our regulators to think about how do we design a system where we're in constant communication and really learning from each other, and making sure that there is a lot of two-way communication into good communication between our regulators. I would also just try and promote the use of passenger rail. In the US, it is, that's a very broad statement, but I think that um,
We love broad state.
more
And you can
trains for
sell it.
everyone.
And you can sell it.
Yeah. I think that if we have one of the challenges with railroads is that in some geographies in the US, there's very few opportunities for people to interact with railroads in a positive way. And it's a great industry. It really is. And the number of job opportunities and careers, I mean, you can be a data scientist and work for a railroad. You can do all these different job functions. You don't just have to be a conductor or an engineer, though those are fantastic careers as well. But it's a little hard to let people experience that side of the industry. And obviously, physically taking a train, being an odd passenger on a train is a great way to do that. But I would also just love to see a world in which we have more opportunities for people to learn about the industry, because I think they'll find it fascinating. And I think that's what you find, right? Like people, when you start talking about railroads, they're curious. Like they want to know more. And you see a lot of kids who grew up loving trains. Like we have to bring back that spark of interest and kind of that real enthusiasm for the
And we also
industries.
and most of us started with the train playing a toy at the Peru railroad.
Exactly. Thomas the Tank Engine, right? It's where it all begins.
Yeah, and basically, like if you look in the future, so how do you envision the railway in 2050?
I envision it in some ways as being the fundamentals being the same, right? We want to have a safe, efficient, strong, and growing sector. I think that we are going to have, I do think the next decade or so is going to be transformational from a technology perspective. I hope that we're going to see a much faster adoption of some of the technologies we've talked about today. And one of the key things I think that's core to growth, especially in the US, is better utilization of the existing assets. It's quite difficult to build a new railroad. It's complex, and how do you deal with the land acquisition, all that. But we have a great physical infrastructure that's in place today, and there's huge opportunities to grow that, to strengthen it, and to think about areas where we may be underutilizing an asset that we hadn't looked at before. So I'd love to see growth in those areas. We are seeing an increasingly diverse workforce as well. And to my comments earlier about attracting more people into the industry, I would love to see that grow. We're seeing an increasing number of women in leadership positions, and just a more diverse workforce all around. So I would hope by 2050 we've made huge advances there. And I also hope that railroads continue to have a place of respect, and there's a lot of legacy and history in the industry, and would love to see that grown and continued, and perhaps seen a little bit more by the people who aren't inside of the industry.
That's actually fantastic closing words. So yeah, I cannot more than agree that we need to inspire the best people for the rail, and there is so much what rail could offer. And once people are actually entered in the world of rail mobility, they start to love the complexity, the impact, and other people. So let's follow this spirit to shape the ecosystem of rail, and that's the spirit of Rail Up. Ida, welcome to the club.
Thank you so much.
What is the contribution to drive climate change?
You can take the train and you can stop wasting food, and you can do the second one at your next meal.
The ball is in your court. What is the next step to drive change?
Taking more accountability for our actions, and thinking more thoughtfully on the small things you can do today and not getting overwhelmed by the big things we need to do over a long period of time. Again, I think it's about a lot of those little moments that add up. And the saying that I always think about on the food waste side is, we're not trying to get one person to do food waste perfectly and to get to zero waste. We're trying to get everyone to do it imperfectly, because that's where the real change happens.
Which superhero do we need to avoid the climate disaster?
I'm going to give you a super cheesy answer. I think we all have to become that superhero. Take responsibility. We have to make this happen. And the reality is, a superhero is not going to come in and fix it. We have to do the work ourselves.
Love it that you don't answer it with the Avenger.
Yeah, well, it's lucky because I don't watch superhero movies, so I have to make up a different answer.
People love superheroes, so.
Yes, and we should be inspired by superheroes.
What's the takeaway from this episode?
My key takeaway of this episode is that rail remains a cornerstone of the economy, especially in North America, providing unmatched efficiency and sustainability. The industry is moving forward with exciting innovations like pop-up metro, rail pulse, and rail flow, which are driving safety, efficiency, and better customer experiences. Despite challenges such as complex regulations in Europe, success stories like RDC's transformation of the Iowa Interstate Railroad show the power of a strategic long-term investment. We also discussed the importance of increasing female leadership in the rail industry, emphasizing the need for mentorship, sponsorship, and proactive efforts to create a more inclusive environment. And of course, rail role in sustainability stood out as the central theme. With its unmatched ability to reduce emissions and shift freight from road to rail, it's one of the most impactful ways to build a greener future. Looking ahead to 2050, Ida envisions a rail industry that is not only more innovative and inclusive, but also better optimized to use the existing infrastructure for growth. So let's keep pushing boundaries and working together to shape the ecosystem of rail for better, and that's Rail Up.
This podcast connects innovators and leaders worldwide to shape the future ecosystem of rail. Rail Up by Sebastian Sperker.